So thank you very much for having me today. I'm really delighted to be giving this talk on reparations and access to medicines. So this is the second part of 3 lectures that I'm giving on reparations. So the first lecture I gave at the University of Toronto on Monday, and it dealt with the idea of rights and reparations more broadly. So today I will be talking about epistemic communities. And on the 15th of November, I will deliver the joint Cambridge Journal of International Law and the Letterpart Center for International Law annual lecture and discuss substantive capitalist barriers to reparations and attempts to mitigate them in a talk titled In the Shadow of Trade, a Critique of Global Health Law. So I'm really grateful to the Wellcome Trust, as Roojin has said. This work is funded as part of an 8-year discovery award called After the End, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Lived Experiences in the Aftermath of Crisis in Global Health. So as part of this project, what we do is to think about the lived experiences of time and temporality of crisis. We get to ask questions about who decides when crises have ended. And access to medicines, of course, is one of those questions, because if you haven't received essential medicines, then the crisis hasn't ended for you. We think about counter narratives and their implications for future practices, responses, and policies in order to foreground new moral and ethical obligations and responsibilities, both at the individual, national, but also institutional level within global health. So why reparations? So in some ways, for me, it was teaching during COVID-19. I had very sad and depressed students. I was very depressed at the state of the world. And this was because I'd done my earlier work on access to essential medicines for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. I'd written this book where I kind of saw the future as being very hopeful. And I kind of thought that we'd had really good, robust international responses to the question of access to medicines. As it turned out, we were very wrong. It turned out countries were hoarding medicines. Companies would not transfer technology. It was a mess. And so I had very, very depressed students, both because they didn't see anybody apart from me on their computer. They were very sad. And it really made me think, like, what do we have if we kind of have no hope as a discipline? And so for me, the idea of thinking much more hopefully is super important, because otherwise what you end up with is despair. You think nothing works, it is all bad, it is terrible. And I think it's really important to reimagine how we can make differences. So this lecture is hopefully a hopeful one, but you will tell me you might still be very depressed at the end of it all. So I'm going to start off with playing a short video with Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the WHO. Sorry, no, he's not the Secretary. He's the Secretary General of the United Nations. And I think it's really important because it helps us to go back to think about COVID-19 as a crisis and to think about kind of his diagnostic of the COVID-19 crisis. So, Giles, could we? I think we have no volume.
Yeah.
Societies we have built. Is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver health care for all. The fiction that unpaid care work is not work. The delusion that we live in a post-racist world. The myth that we are all in the same boat. Enough of the structural racism and systematic injustice that deny people their fundamental human rights. These movements point to 2 of the historic sources of inequality in our world: colonialism and patriarchy. Colonialism created vast inequality within and between countries, including the evils of the transatlantic slave trade and the apartheid regime here in South Africa. After the Second World War, The creation of the United Nations was based on a new global consensus around equality and human dignity. And the wave of decolonization swept the world. But let's not fool ourselves. The legacy of colonialism still reverberates. COVID-19 is a human tragedy, but it has also created a generational opportunity. An opportunity to build back a more equal and sustainable world.
So I think we need to move to the next slide. So I try to kind of use kind of that backward look and the words of the UN Secretary General at the 18th Nelson Mandela lecture, who made kind of amazing connections between the idea of COVID-19 crisis, colonialism, and the idea of inspiring and giving us potential for reimagining a new global health law. So in this lecture, I will draw on these linkages to argue that the enduring question of access to essential medicines, which plague the global response to various pandemics, from HIV/AIDS, where I started my earlier work, to Ebola, which I worked on a bit, to COVID-19, and now to mpox, can be analyzed through a broader post-colonial history of global health injustice. So I will illustrate, hopefully, how this problem remains rooted in colonial medicine, which views some people as expendable and privileges the treatment of some diseases over others. This, for me, is sustained by the way in which we've constructed the international trade regime through the WTO, which has sustained a neocolonial mechanism of unequal access to medicines by allowing private corporations, mainly based in the global north, the ability to set high prices, thereby excluding many in the global south from accessing life-saving medicines. So there have been attempts in law to think through this. So part of kind of the reason that I was so optimistic in the early 2000s was things like the UN's Doha Declaration on Health, the creation of specific programs like the 3x5 program, which aimed to put 3 million people on antiretrovirals by 2005, the creation of specific bodies like UNITAID, which were supposed to do kind of grand bargaining in order to bulk purchase medicines. And all these kind of arguably used kind of a human rights approach in order to create broader access to medicines. However, we know that this wasn't kind of very effective. And what I try and argue is that we need a much more ambitious kind of human rights that seeks more than just thinking about rights, kind of everyday natures of rights, but really tries to think about a reparative justice. So we need to move to the next slide. So in that slide, in this slide, I kind of think about the legacy of colonial medicine and access to medicines, for me, in 4 really interesting ways. So the first, which is a slide of colonial medicine. So it's entitled kind of Colonial Medicine. It's in the archives at the Wellcome Trust. So if you go to London, the Wellcome Trust is near St. Pancras. It's a free museum and it's really, really good. I would urge you to go. And I think it's an interesting photograph because it really illustrates the nature of colonial medicine as being both kind of benevolent. So the idea that you're helping these people who can't help themselves. But behind it, what we know from people like Anderson, who write about this period, is that it both kind of saw itself as giving, but it was also very extractive. And so in some ways, it viewed the people on whom it practiced, and I think you have similar experiences in Canada with Indigenous populations of viewing colonial medicine viewing local cultures, knowledges as unhealthy or inferior, and keeping racial inequalities in place with the provision of colonial medicine as a benevolent act. And this is a form of systemic violence because it breeds the idea that some medicine is not as equal as other medicine. So this, for me, is still an enduring legacy, and we see it in four fundamental ways. So the first is through clinical research. So we know that a lot of clinical trials take place now largely in the global south because most people do not want to be part of clinical trials. You have to leave university, if you're at university, or leave your job and go and take part in a clinical trial. And so we've outsourced clinical trials from the global north to the global south. And many people are taking on this risk in the global south without any of the attendant benefits or medicines that are cheaper. So the majority world in this way remains a site of experimentation without necessarily getting any of the benefits. The second is through global health scholarship. So that image by Madhu Pai, who's actually a Canadian, who's an Indian-Canadian scholar, is illustrating the idea of epistemic injustice in global health. And so in his work, and other scholars like Shea Ayimbola, they illustrate the idea of the global north as practicing asymmetries of power and privilege, and coloniality becomes one of these asymmetries that leads to epistemic injustice where knowledge and expertise from the global south, again, are systematically undervalued and are treated as sites of inquiry and not as sites where knowledge is generated. This is particularly important in the research and development process because of the way in which you're ascribing value to places. So if you are using places as testing grounds and not seeing them as places where you create knowledge, then that is deeply problematic. And so I'd really recommend the work of two Indigenous scholars. One is called Naidu and the other is called Quinjano on epistemic violence, and the work of healers, which I think is really important. So the third example is around the passports. And so it's an idea of colonialism and the racialization of border enforcement. In this case, people from the global south are imagined to spread disease both historically, but also still in contemporary times. And so we see this, if you take global health law, in global health law as a discipline, you spend a lot of time at the beginning of global health law thinking about those sanitary conferences. And those sanitary conferences come from the idea of countries in the global north being afraid of disease moving from the south to the north. But we also see it in more contemporary times. So for those of you who remember during COVID-19, when South Africa sequenced the Omicron variant, many countries very quickly closed their borders to it. But actually, this wasn't even individual. So they closed their borders not only to South Africa, but to also the countries around South Africa. So there is a collectiveness of that kind of border closure that you have that is incredibly racialized and also colonial in nature. The fourth is on pharmaceutical production. So scholars such as Neil and others observed that pharmaceutical production actually was highly prevalent in Africa during the colonial age, but this waned during the post-colonial era. And so these places have become, again, places of testing, but they do not have pharmaceutical companies. And so you could argue that, okay, so it might be that Africa doesn't have pharmaceutical companies, but India and Thailand do. But even in those places where we have strong pharmaceutical companies like India and Thailand, we know from people like Sarah Hodges that there's actually lots of work on suspicion. So there's lots of work on Indian medicines being not quite the right medicines, a lot of ideas around fakeness from Indian medicines. And so even when you have those places as sites of production, there's still quite a lot in terms of that taint of suspicion that comes from it. And we saw it again with the anxieties around certain vaccines that were being manufactured in the global south. So we need to move to the next slide. And so in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Director General of the WHO established the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. And this was in order to kind of try and think about ways in which we could review COVID, but also reimagine a future. And so this was the so-called Pandemic Accord. And so those of you who are studying global health know that this didn't pass. And in some ways, this lecture is an attempt to kind of have a retrospective of the actors who were involved. And so many scholars, Roojin's one of them, have done fantastic work pointing to the explicit lack of focus on human rights as a foundational idea of equity within that pandemic accord. And I argue that actually that human rights approach would really be quite critical because it enables us to have that reparative account of international law. So before I kind of go to who are the actors involved, I'll talk a bit about reparations. Next slide, please. So reparations is derived from the word repair. So when I was very depressed in 2020, trying to think about the world in which I practiced, I was trying to think about ways of repairing it, of remedying the damage and harm caused by acts that I thought were sometimes illegal and sometimes immoral. And this idea of reparation is an old one. And there's been quite a lot of work done on reparations, especially in post-conflict settings, but also there's been work done on reparations within the context of slavery, both at the national level in contexts such as the USA, in Jamaica, but also increasingly you have really exciting and interesting work on reparations being done in environmental law. And I'd be happy to talk about those links as I see them between the environment and health. In 2019, the Lancet organized a panel on reparations and redistributive justice, but this mainly focused on Black Americans. But what I try to do is to try and take some of that work further and think, what could reparations look like if we thought about reparations for a much bigger group? So those of you who are lawyers can already see the problem. So by moving from a really tight group to the majority world, it's a really big group. So you have issues around the largeness of the group. You have much bigger issues around causation, who caused the harm. And then you have issues around the kind of remedies that you want. So what exactly am I looking for if I can make the case that they're reparations? Next slide, please. And so I've kind of spent some time thinking about reparations. The UN has done some work on reparations as well in the basic principles and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparations for victims of gross violence of international law and serious violations of international human rights law. They thought about 5 categories, and you see those on your right. So restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and non-repetition. So I'm going to spend a lot of time, I think, in the lecture talking about non-repetition, the idea that we don't want things to happen again, drawing from Antonio Guterres' idea of like never again. So we want a just future. We want a future that doesn't look like the past. So many scholars have thought about kind of these ideas of reparation, again, through transatlantic slave trade, the aftermath of World War II, ongoing climate crisis. And in these, they kind of think about 2 things. They think about whether you want your reparations to be backward looking, to look to the past and account for harm, or forward looking in order to try and think about structural inequalities both now and in the future. And there's really exciting work, for instance, around the human rights of future generations, or the world that we want our children to live in and how that might look like. And that might be kind of a future looking harm. So, and it's really important to note that actually these are not just handouts or payment. You kind of have to have two essential requirements. One is symbolic, so ideas around acknowledgement, that I think is very main course in Canada, because you acknowledge land, for instance. So there's kind of symbolic reparations. And then there is material reparations around kind of what you do once you've made that acknowledgement. And so there've been two main strands of work. So the first strand of work has been around reparations, at least particularly in health, which I deal with, around the slave health deficit. And this work recognizes that the descendants of slaves have intergenerational health harms that still leave the descendants of slavery with much worse health impacts than other people, than their white counterparts, for instance. And so this reparation then seeks to change health systems in order to address those inequities. And it does that in particular ways. So a lot of work, for instance, around training of Black doctors was taking place. And then also recognition of large-scale medical harms, so things like Tuskegee in the States, where really kind of trying to think through those ideas of harm. And then there's really interesting work, I think, on intersectional harm for systemic violence. So things like social reproduction, why do more Black women die in labor than their white counterparts many, many years after slavery? And so some of this work has led to a mix of both symbolic and structural reparations. So the American Medical Association, for instance, apologized in 2008 for its collusion with segregation of Black doctors. And so that's kind of a symbolic act. There've then been successive programs to train Black doctors in order to encourage parity. And that's kind of a much more forward-looking program. But then there's also kind of much smaller work. So for instance, the creation of trusts that deal with social reproduction for Black women. So people like Dorothy Roberts have done a lot of work, both around kind of how those trusts might be constituted, but also how you might use digital health, for instance, in order to account for both the historic harm, but also how you might try and address it in the future, which I think is important. There's also been interesting work in health on reparations for war victims. So in the concept of transitional justice. So for instance, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in Sierra Leone, recommended extensive reparations for war victims. And part of that was really thinking through health reparations. So it's included, for instance, mental health for amputees. It was very intersectional. So it thought about sexual violence and those particular harms, and then thought about pensions and a lot of other material benefits. So due to financial constraints, a lot of the health benefits got struck out, and that's something to consider when we're thinking about the limitations of some of this, because a lot of the reparations that you might seek for health benefits would be really expensive, would be ongoing. And so that is in some ways one of the problems. And so I try and move from that to kind of think about what would my approach be to reparations. So of course, I want people to kind of symbolically acknowledge harm, but I want them to go much further and also think about the structures. And so I draw from the work of Olufemi Tayo, who's a scholar in Georgetown, who thinks about the idea of reparations as a tool for world making, to make the world more just and equitable. He is very critical of symbolic reparations because he thinks that they're very cheap, and therefore it's very easy to kind of say, I'm sorry, and he really wants people to put their money where their mouth is. but I kind of try and think about, so his context is very particular. So he's thinking about like slavery. And so I try and think in my context, what would reparations look like? So I would draw reparations from rights. And so they would have that collective nature and make linkages between the right to health more broadly and reparations. And so one's individual gain would be contingent on the collective whole. And I think that that's where you would draw differences, for instance, from some of these projects, for instance, the one in California where they gave descendants of slavery like a lump sum for housing, because I think that that doesn't deal with the structural problem. So in my scenario, the one person's benefit has to be contingent on a collective. The second is that it would have to be transformative and represent an evolving approach that addresses those historic injustices that attribute to colonialism in the beginning and move beyond traditional forms of compensation. And so this would, again, take seriously ideas of intersectional harm. So thinking about transformative, like feminist ideas of transformative repair would be really useful. And that would mean that you have a broader array of things than you might have. The second would be thinking about things like intergenerational poverty and health outcomes, and really drawing in trade in order to fix those relationships, so that you're not giving people a lump sum, but you're thinking about the wider trade system that makes some of these unequal. So for instance, there's some really interesting work around the Caribbean islands, which continue to have particular health harms due to dumping of unhealthy foods due to NAFTA, but also due to that large, long history of slavery. And then my final aspect would be to take agency seriously. And I think Tayo, in his later work on against decolonization, really wants people to take agency seriously and think about the ways in which states from the majority world can reclaim these spaces in order to articulate their demands on the health system. So, and if you have thought about international law ostensibly gives every country one voice. And so this would actually be a rupture of that international law system, because it would be making a different demand of that system and saying it needs to center differently the way in which it carries out its negotiations. Next slide. So I will speak very briefly about reparations and human rights in particular. So I draw a lot from the work of Torres on his work around reparations and inherent dignity, and the idea that we can think about reparations as corrective justice. And I think I find his work really useful because they take a lot from the ESRC's committee, which has thought about violence and the need to have economic and social programs, so that if you have like structural violence, that actually what you should have is lots of economic and social programs, so that the highest number of people enjoy their economic and social and cultural rights. And I think I like this work a lot, but because a lot of this work is kind of very nation focused, I then tried to draw from like Lane and Foxman's work on redistributive justice, because that really links kind of colonial acts to this larger notion of distributive justice, which I think is really important. So there you then have to acknowledge past wrongs, but then you then have to have social and economic, you then have to have that acknowledgement, but then you then have some ideas of solidarity, so that once you've acknowledged it, then countries get obligations around duties in order to redistribute some of the wealth that they have to those countries, but not as compensation, but as social economic programs, which I think is useful. Next slide. Okay, so having done kind of that like theoretical work, I was then thinking, which communities do you need, like which communities, when I reflect, have been really useful for thinking about repair within global health as a discipline. So the pandemic accord, for me, presented an opportunity for different epistemic communities to engage in projects that would enable reparations. And epistemic communities I define as networks of professionals with recognized knowledge and skill in particular issue areas. So it was interesting for me because I then had that tension between kind of a recognition of some knowledge, but then also thinking about knowledge itself as being colonial. And I try and deal with that in particular ways. So I kind of recognize that tension at the beginning, and it's not fully worked out. So any bright answers, please tell me about them. So I focus on three particular communities. The first is academic communities. The second is civil society coalitions. And the third was negotiating coalitions. So next slide is. So academic communities. So the academic community work came from a lot of the work that Roojin has done. So it was really interesting for me to think about it critically beyond work that I think is interesting and isn't she fantastic? So this work, I think, is really thinking through the work that international experts and how their role in rethinking international law both works, but actually the way in which we might want, one in which it kind of created some system for repair, but also whether it kind of lived up to its ideals in terms of really kind of challenging the status quo. So I think there so these guidelines, which came out of a group of academics, again, trying to rethink international law, I think was really helpful because one of the things that they particularly did was to try and reinforce the idea of solidarity that is critical to ensuring access to medicines. And so really saying that actually solidarity is not just a wish. Solidarity is something that has kind of its origins within the international law system. And so I'm going back to my tension. So these are academics, they are very privileged. And so I kind of had to think, like, what makes this work reparatory? So it might be reparatory in aim, but kind of was it reparatory in process? And I thought actually it meets my standard of reparatory in process because the academics were wide-ranging. So there were academics from the global north and the global south. There was a lot of listening work that took place from communities that were affected. But also once the principles were created, from the academics, this wasn't the final say-so. So there was a huge process of regional consultation that then really helped to refine these principles. And so clarifying that principle of solidarity as an obligation, thinking about the obligations of non-state actors, but then the process itself as doing some repair work or challenging the international system as to how you make law was, for me, what made it a truly reparative system. Next slide, please. So the second was civil society coalitions, and I'm less actually convinced by this particular category. So I was very convinced by it on Monday and then less convinced by it today, which should give any of you who's struggling with anything academic or critical hope is that there's an existential struggle. So civil society coalitions, voluntary organizations, which in particular in health, they work in development, human rights, medicine. They use multiple levels of engagement. Many of them work at the grassroots. And so I kind of had to think about these different coalitions. So for instance, those of you who were active during COVID in movements know that the People's Vaccine Alliance was very, very visceral and vocal. They, I think, had a long engagement with access to medicines from HIV/AIDS. Now with MPOX, they're really like a multitude of them, really vocal, really kind of global. And so one of the things which I thought that they've been like fantastic at, they've been, I thought three things. One was narratives, is they've helped to shape narratives. So they popularized terms like vaccine apartheid, which really kind of brought into sharp focus what was happening, that Canada had 9 times the vaccines that it needed and some countries didn't. And that really was a system that was killing people. So I think that their narratives were important. In terms of the negotiations, they've really, really pushed the boundaries of participation in terms of that system, a system that is closed, a system that is for states. And they've been really, really pushing hard to push the boundaries of what participation should look like. And the third thing that I think some of them have done is really pushing hard for thinking about manufacturing in the global south. And this is both kind of actively just pushing for money, and some of them really on the ground, really kind of thinking through about the skills that you need, the technology transfer that you need. And so I'm kind of torn about whether this work is truly like meets the threshold of repair. I think that the last category of vaccine manufacturing, which is very active, might meet that category, but I'm not very convinced about the other two and would like to hear from other people about their thoughts. And so next slide, please. And so my last category, I think, is an interesting one. I didn't mean to cancel the Africa group. They still exist. So like most grassroots movements, the Africa group is a loose confederation as opposed to a formal group. And in ongoing work I have been doing with 2 colleagues, Maria Birungi and Shajo Lane, we identify the development at 3 critical stages. So how does it emerge and become a group? So the first is 8 African member states were participants in the Group for Equity, which was a coalition of 29 states of low and middle income countries. The second is that members then identified a continental stance on what they wanted, what they meant by equity. So, because equity can mean anything. So equity means different things to different people. And so I think that that was really important. So they did this with the Africa CDC. And the third was that they were really quite vocal in trying to get the international health regulations and the pandemic treaty being ratified, being agreed at the same time. They were not successful, by the way. So just putting that out there. So, and I thought that this idea of going in with one single strategy was really important. And I tried to kind of think about their particular stance in terms of their negotiating treaty in particular ways. And I think where I can see like really reparatory work is in 2 main areas. One is access and benefit sharing, and the second is around technology transfers. So access and benefit sharing is a really odd thing in global health law. So if you have a pandemic, the idea is that you need to send samples as quickly as possible to the WHO so that other countries can know what you have. And that then helps pharmaceutical companies to then use those samples in order to try and find a vaccine or whatever diagnostic or other remedies that you might need. But that kind of means, if you think about it, that there is this idea that there is a public good, which would be nice if you were then not giving it to a pharmaceutical company that's then going to make the medicine hugely unaffordable for you. And so the Africa group was really quite vocal about what they wanted from this idea of access and benefit sharing. And they were saying, like, we are very happy to treat it as a public good, but we need some capacity, building in return. And so I thought that that was a really interesting notion that really fits within rights, because it's thinking of the collective, it's thinking the right to health is collective, but it's also kind of trying to repair structure system so that you build capacity, in this case, which could be physical, human resources, and then also around building of a vaccine manufacturing base. The second bit was around kind of several percentages, which then you might get, which again wasn't successful at all. But I thought that the kind of the underlying idea was kind of a really interesting reparative idea. The second was around technology transfers, where they were calling for an agreement to mandate technology transfer. And they wanted to create obligations on governments to facilitate these technology transfers. And then they wanted to create pandemic funding. And this, again, was then supposed to feed into this technology transfers. If you got some money, it was public money. And then therefore you had an obligation to transfer your technology. And then the last was to really build that vaccine manufacturing base on vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. And increase that manufacturing base from 1% to 60% by 2040. So I kind of think that the inclusion of technology transfers was really interesting because it's challenging the trade system that we have, I think. And I thought that the ideas around regional health autonomy and resilience were really building a new system of governance within health. And this was kind of a form of reimagining a global health system, which I thought would have been really useful for future pandemics. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide, sorry. Okay, so everything is cancelled. So what are the limitations of these epistemic communities? So as I pointed out, they haven't been wholly successful. One, even ensuring that rights themselves appear. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is kind of reading rights where rights haven't been explicitly mentioned. And so I think that that is a real problem. And then we didn't agree a pandemic accord, but I was one of the people who thought a bad agreement, like having no agreement, was better than no agreement. And I know that views on this vary. The third, I think, is that human rights are becoming increasingly political, and states are struggling to reinforce even the most basic rights. And so ideas of reparations make those rights even more complex. And I acknowledge that there are dangers in layering an extra obligation on reparations, because that might mean that these epistemic communities then lose their legitimacy, because you're just proposing even more stuff when people think, but like, I don't have health, like, why are you adding something else to it? So I could make these epistemic communities that I think are great, like just see more so. And then the final one is kind of my tension of these are all really interesting communities, but they're all professional communities. And I think that this risks a distortion of grassroots mobilization of rights. So who's speaking on behalf of whom? So the Africa group are clearly speaking on, but there's still health ministers. And so are they really speaking for grassroots movements? And I think this is already a problem for international law. So when you speak to people, when I had a chat with my taxi driver this morning, and he was a bit puzzled about what international law does for him. And so there's kind of a sense that people think like international law is very far. And epistemic communities, although much closer, so If you are in an academic community, you might think, okay, it's a bit closer to me. If you volunteer for a rights movement, you might think it's a bit closer to me. But there is still that other danger that actually they're still taking this international law much further from you. And so that's kind of my last thing, my second last slide. And so my last slide is, so I started off with kind of hope. And so I've been reading Bell Hooks' idea of love as a verb and trying to think, now that I've kind of met everybody like really unhopeful, why should we still be hopeful? And so I think for me, the idea of rights has never been like all at once. So if you think about the history of rights, and Upendra Baxi writes about this like really beautifully. He says, contemporary human rights rose to give voice to suffering and to ameliorate it. So all these communities give voices to this suffering, and it doesn't all happen at once. So that if we take even little steps, that kind of is a win. And we see that there are some changes, even small ones. So the pandemic accord did not succeed, but that didn't mean everybody gave up and went home. They came back and regrouped. They tried to think, how can we reimagine it? There've been reinforcements of rights in certain places. There's been much bigger spaces for people who are not states to speak within the spaces where we are deciding international law in the pandemic accord. There's been a wider recognition around ideas of both temporality, but also costs of making law, and really trying to think about those in terms of the global south. And actually, for me, the most hopeful thing is that we're beginning to see some really interesting work around vaccine manufacturing, especially on the African continent, but some also in Asia and in Latin America, beginning to emerge from what doesn't feel like very hopeful times. And so we must go forward and we must kind of be optimistic, however little. It will be well. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Sekalala. I really appreciate the end on a hopeful note, which we forget to do very often here in law and the profession of law and the research of law. There's much work left to be done always. And so the reminder that it's usually a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that march towards progress is really important for us to keep at the top of our mind. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking presentation. And as you know, I have several questions for you, but I also have the benefit of spending the day with you. So I would like to first open the floor to folks in the room. If anybody has questions, I see one is already over there. Please, I'll come give you the mic as well so we can hear everyone's questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Joachim, and I am an LLM candidate in Health Law Policy and Ethics at the University of Ottawa, and I am glad to be here, and I'm grateful to the center. It's the best center, I always say, in North America. Yeah. So I saw a flyer about your presentation, and I was intrigued because of your name. That's why I asked you, and I am glad that I've come and I've actually perceived a lot. And now back to your presentation. I had 2 pointers that I wanted to point out. One was about the politicization of the access to medicine, the politicization of the access to the right to healthcare, especially in the global south. So speaking about all this and not speaking about politics would have been bad, but I'm glad that you actually did. My second thing was about the specificity, because there are lots of communities in the global south, but each community has specific needs, right? So I feel like you should really look at specificity, because the problems that affect maybe a Ugandan single woman mother are different from those that may affect someone in another part of the global south, for instance. So my proposal is that they should incorporate specificity. The solution should be custom tailored for a particular community. Thank you so much. Oh, just one more thing. And about politicization, usually all these things are sent to the global south, but the people who tend to be the service providers, the policy formulators and everything tend to be by and large political appointees. They are not usually technocrats. So we need to always counter that and have that in mind while, I don't know, doing the reparation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joaquin. I pass it over to you, Sharifah. Would you like to take a couple questions first and then address them? Okay. All right. Coming over to you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to really show some appreciation for the topic that you covered. I don't think it's something that a lot of people are thinking about. It's very forward thinking, especially with how with the internet and with the rise of communications, we're integrating ourselves not just as like nations, but as communities and countries. I did want to ask your opinion when you pointed out specifically about performative activism, in that a lot of lip service is done when it comes to apologizing for harms done to certain communities, like the First Nations, like Black Americans, and other communities around the world. Do you think that these formative acts have still a place in the reparations that are meant to be paid? One of the individuals that you pointed out said that he was not of the opinion that any of these performative acts had a place, and he would much rather see an investment that had a monetary value in pushing forward some change. But as we've seen, like from the First Nations, they really do want that acknowledgement, that maybe not the performative action of it, but the acknowledgement of this was your land, this is what we want. And especially with healthcare, when we see that a lot of the medicine wasn't being allocated properly, like people do want these things to be said. Do you think that it is like on the scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think it is to publicly acknowledge that these things are going on? And then my second question was, what did you say to the taxi driver when he asked you why it was important for him to be so concerned about international law? Because that also was a thought in the back of my head. I was so happy you shared that anecdote, because I did not know how to articulate it myself. I understand the importance of it, but I think in the context of individuals, we tend to like lose the bigger picture. So if you would just explain how you view this moving forward on an individual, going from like the big global picture to an individual person benefiting from this.
Mark, I'll come to you and then we can pass it over to Sharifah. It's a big room. Lots of space to cover.
Hello, my name is Ray Marquinera. I'm a third-year law student here at the University of Ottawa Common Law program. In your speech about the Global South being underappreciated in terms of the knowledge that they provide, I'm also curious on how do these communities address the disparities caused by perhaps like stringent patent laws in the global north in terms of financializing and industrializing medicines that the global south need. What strategies can be employed to challenge these laws in terms of the reparations that you were talking about when it comes to forward looking? And yeah, how do you believe the academic epistemic communities actively argue for the balance between protecting maybe intellectual property when it comes to pharmaceutical inventions and ensuring the right to health with the groups that we mentioned today? Thank you.
We'll do a round and then I'll close.
Yeah, no, so really kind of super question. So, yeah, there's a politicization of the global south. Yes, yeah. So there is there is politicization of the global south, and but there's kind of politics everywhere. So there's politics in all health systems, and I think the broader picture is to think about harm. Otherwise, you kind of have to think about like what you want from like communities. And I think in some ways, I think, yeah, they're bad governments, they corrupt governments, but they still were charged like deeply problematic prices for essential medicines. So like that kind of, you could get really stuck. And in some ways, I think health is a good way of thinking about it, because people, for instance, make unhealthy choices, but people have to treat them. So we don't kind of say, well, you caused your own cancer, tough. And if we take that as a starting point, that we think everybody deserves health, then, and also people sometimes don't deserve the governments they have. So if this is a rights-based approach that is really rooted in the suffering of people, sometimes they don't deserve the governments. They didn't vote for them. Their politicians have been in power too long. And so we still need to kind of think through what justice for those people looks like and not lose sight of that. So the second thing was about specificity. So in some ways, the reason why I like the reparations approach that is transformational is that it's intersectional as well. And so this for me feels like something that could solve a whole host of social and economic problems while trying to think about access to medicines at the same time within programs. So it might be that that woman's problem is, yes, both access to medicines, but also traveling to a health center. And an economic social approach is much broader than just giving them a single dose of access to medicines. It's thinking about kind of the broad framework within which she lives and trying to think about some of those other economic social rights that are contingent on getting that medicine to her. And so I think that that's why it's useful to think intersectionally in that way. The third was, if I had to rank symbolic and material. So I think actually symbolism is important, because if you don't think about the reason that you are thinking through something, and in some ways I think that's part of the presentation was like going back. And going back actually gives you that notion of saying, we have to acknowledge that there's a long history here of colonial harms before we can move forward, because the risk of not going back far enough is that these feel like short-term problems. It feels like a supply chain problem that we're addressing, or it feels like we were just not prepared in time, but actually going far enough gives you kind of that moment of thinking much more around your symbolic responsibility for the harm and then trying to think about ways of addressing it. So it would be quite high on my list, but if it was just symbolic, then it would be problematic. So reparations is not a band-aid, means that it has to be more than symbolic. So you have to then accompany it by a material action. And my material action is not monetary or just compensation. It has to be a broad-based action that is more social, economic, in order to fit within my rights framework that is collective. What did I tell the taxi driver? So this is weird because I'm really jet lagged. So I'd been up since 2 a.m. in the morning. And so I was having this conversation and thinking, I'm not coherent at all. And so we had question. So because I think, as Roojin mentioned, my other project is on digital health. And so I didn't talk to him about international law and access to medicines, but I talked to him about international law and the digital, and how the digital changes things, what he feels about his data belonging to a company, and how some of that choice is going to be very, very hard for just one country, which was Canada, to make those choices anymore, because his smartphone is probably based somewhere else. Actually, there's a US Act, the US Cloud Act means that if it's an American smartphone, the data must have a copy in the USA. And so we had a really long and involved chat about what that meant in terms of who owned his health data, where it went, who profited from it, and how he could ever get any autonomy that wasn't just, I know who has it. So if somebody made a profit from it, how does he as an individual get some autonomy? And so I said, like, that there for me is the benefit of an international law system. And this is where you hold your government to account. Your government can do amazing things if individuals push. I don't think I convinced him. I'd like another stab at that, but it's I think an interesting question of like what should the individual do? And I think there are many things that individuals can do, and the international system is a pervasive system in terms of helping us to think through some of these things. And then there was a question of patents. So for those people in the Global South, I guess we have really good remedies. So you could have a compulsory license. But if you're a country that has no vaccine manufacturer, then having a compulsory license doesn't mean anything to you. And so there is something about having the tools, again, still within the reparatory model, of exerting that form of control around, I need this medicine, I need it urgently, I can then use this particular tool in order to get it. And I'm not advocating that each individual country has one of these. And for me, that was one of the things that I found persuasive about the Africa Group. It wasn't advocating that. It was advocating hubs so that you still had regional infrastructure that was really useful in order to help you to achieve those vaccines. So I think that that is really useful, thinking through kind of the wider socioeconomic infrastructure you need in order to kind of challenge some of these pattern rules. Is there anything you haven't responded to? Okay.
Any last questions? Can take two more. Go ahead.
First off, I also want to say thank you. I liked your initial framing of like the temporality of crisis and how moments of crisis can be hopeful in terms of like the ability for it to be malleable, more malleable than in other moments. And we know that crises, like they repeat, they will come often. So I thank you for that. My specific question was actually regarding regional autonomy and like the Africa Group that you spoke of. I was wondering how you would perceive like Global South solidarity in terms of having multiple groups which are like regionally autonomous, similar to the Africa Group, but like you have one in South Asia, Latin America, like as such, and whether that would be like a feasible method to push for a more just global health law system.
Any other questions? Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Can I just switch behind you?
I can just project.
I think it's more so for the Zoom.
Oh.
Yeah, you're as much as you'd like to project, it will not.
Thank you. You mentioned you have a collision about ways of knowing, which I also feel a lot of the time. And so I was wondering, what's your approach to that? You said it's not really working out for you, but is it like epistemic pluralism? Is it like, how are you decolonizing kind of the language?
Short and succinct. Thanks, sorry.
So yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So in some way, it's really interesting also because, so yes, that I kind of think that it would be nice to have these groups have more power, but there is also a tension sometimes because they don't all want the same things. And sometimes their needs collide, but actually that's the system that we have. We all want different things. But I think that suddenly reimagining a global system where they have more power and they are projecting their voice in a much more unified way. And so one of the things that I didn't cover, for instance, was the way in which the Africa group tried to deal with co-option, because at times, like certain members of it got co-opted, and then there was like a reorienting of like, actually, this is what we want. So like, yes, you four went off, but then they kind of had these meetings where it was a sense of, again, reimagining. And I think that that's really useful when you have a regional grouping, because you have this kind of common sense of what is best for you. And I found the language actually of that rebuttal when they were being co-opted really interesting because of the things that they highlighted, that if four of them decided to crack, then everybody lost. And that was going to be a bad thing for the continent. So I think that for me, that is really hopeful and useful. And it's actually then linked to the second one around this pluralism, is that, yes, there is that tension around these different epistemic communities. And it's not fully resolved in my head, because I think once you then have certain forms of knowledge, there are dangers of those hierarchies, and then those hierarchies might replicate the kinds of harm that you're trying to do away with. And so one of the things that was, for instance, really important being part of the academic group around the principles was being very, very attentive to the kind of power that we had. And maybe that's where symbolism comes in, that sometimes those symbolic understandings of wrongs are really important to make you aware that even, so I am a scholar who's in the global north, I come from the global south, but that too still comes with a certain kind of privilege. I was vaccinated to begin with. So like while I was writing about the global south, I was still vaccinated, I could travel. And that comes with privilege, and maybe that symbolic reparation is then useful in those groups in order to try and then not replicate the kinds of harms. I think the second thing around epistemic pluralism that is important is intersectionality, is to really think through how those groups are intentionally intersectional, because that's very useful in trying to mitigate harm. You have people with those very different characteristics who are challenging that group to imagine different kinds of harm, because I think that that is one of the problems with international communities when decision-making, is that despite attempts, it's still kind of very much of the same. And so that's quite useful.
I think I'm conscious that there's room changes that need to happen in 10 minutes or so. I do encourage you, though, if you have questions for Professor Sekalala, we still have a bit of time, and I'm deliberately leaving that time for you to have a moment to chat with her if you'd like to. I want to say a huge thanks to Professor Sekalala for joining us for this talk today, for connecting the dots across so many spaces and bringing us from the past to present day. For the students, please feel free to take more food to take them to your class as well. If you want to take a tray, feel free to take it to your class. And thank you so much for joining us. Please join me in a round of applause for Professor Sekalala.